The Bennett family's disappearance in 1994 was a quiet, heartbreaking tragedy, but it wasn't a mystery until a decade later, when a discarded camera revealed a final, chilling photograph, a picture that was believed to be the last clue in a man's descent into madness. They thought the case was solved. They were wrong. The horror wasn't in the family's tragic end, but in the realization that they were just the first victims in a series of disappearances, lured into the silent depths of the wilderness by a sound no one else could hear. The story of the Bennett family's disappearance began in September 1994. The family consisted of four members: Robert, the father; Ellen, the mother; and their two children, Jason and Katie. They lived in a quiet neighborhood in Idaho, USA, and were known as a loving and normal family. They often spent time together, and their sudden vanishing was something no one could have ever predicted. On a Monday morning, the school called the police because the children hadn't shown up. When the police went to check the family's house, they found it in perfect order, as if the owners had just stepped out for a moment. However, a strange detail emerged. Their pet dog had been left behind without food, and their car was gone. There were no signs of a struggle or forced entry, suggesting they had left voluntarily. The police launched an intensive search for the family and their car, but without any results. The case eventually went cold. 10 years passed, and in 2004, a young police officer named Marissa Duval was going through old files in the office. She stumbled upon an old evidence box without a clear label. Inside, she found a disposable camera with the date the 5th of October 1994 scrawled on it. Just a few days after the Bennett family's disappearance, she took the camera to be developed, and a flicker of hope was reignited. The first photos that were developed were normal family snapshots, them playing in front of the house, smiling in the car, and other happy moments. But the final photo was the most shocking and chilling of all. It was a slightly blurry picture taken inside their cabin at night. It showed Robert standing still, unlike his usual smile. His face was pale, devoid of emotion, and his eyes stared directly into the camera, as if he knew something was happening. This was a photo the police had never seen before. This strange photo became the most crucial clue, completely changing the direction of the investigation. The police revisited the location where their car was eventually found, as well as the area around the cabin, and what they discovered was one of the most tragic outcomes in the history of missing persons cases. The final photograph provided the mysterious answer that the Bennett family had met a terrible fate there. The story proves that sometimes the truth can be scarier than fiction. The discovery of that final, unsettling photograph was the key that unlocked the decade-old mystery. Guided by the location where the picture was taken, investigators returned to the dense, remote woods surrounding the family's cabin. This time, a more thorough search of the dilapidated structure revealed a hidden journal belonging to Robert, tucked away beneath the floorboards, and a cryptic note scrawled on a piece of paper found in the cabin's fireplace. The journal was a chilling account of a mind's unraveling. Robert's writings detailed his descent into a severe mental break, where he believed he was being called by an otherworldly hum to embark on a spiritual journey into the wilderness. He wrote of his family as his companions, convinced that he was protecting them by leading them away from what he called the artificial world. His final entries became increasingly disjointed and frantic, painting a picture of a man lost to his own delusions, leading his innocent family deeper and deeper into the forest. With this new understanding, the search shifted from a criminal investigation to a recovery mission. The police eventually located the family's abandoned station wagon in a remote, overgrown area far off any known road. Just a short distance from the vehicle, in a secluded clearing, they made the heartbreaking discovery: the remains of Ellen, Jason, and Katie. Forensic analysis concluded that they had died from exposure and hypothermia, with no signs of violence, a tragic testament to the devastating power of Robert's untreated illness. The case was officially closed, concluding that the family's disappearance was a result of a father's severe mental illness, not a crime committed by an outsider. However, one final, haunting question remained unanswered. Despite extensive searches, Robert's remains were never found. He had seemingly vanished into the vast wilderness. he so fervently believed was his destiny, leaving behind a profound and somber mystery for all who came to know the tragic story of the Bennett family. The official search for Robert Bennett was called off months after the discovery, but unofficially, the mystery lingered for years among locals and seasoned park rangers. The vast Idaho wilderness had a way of swallowing people whole, and it was a common belief that his remains would never be found. However, 8 years later, a seasoned park ranger named Elias stumbled upon a small, hidden cave in a crevice of the mountains, far from any established trail. He wasn't searching for anything in particular, but the cave's entrance was unusually obscured by a natural rock fall. Inside, nestled behind a boulder, he found a weathered backpack and a worn-out, water-damaged journal. Robert's journal. The final pages, written in a shaky hand, were no longer filled with talk of a hum or a spiritual journey. They were coherent and terrifying. Robert's last entry described a sudden, horrifying moment of clarity. He wrote of his family's shivering bodies, of their terrified eyes looking at him with despair, and of a moment where the delusion that had clouded his mind suddenly lifted. He saw his children's frostbitten feet and his wife's pleading face, and he finally understood the monstrous thing he had done. The entry was the last he ever wrote, trailing off with a simple, desperate apology to his family. His remains were never found in or near the cave. The final conclusion was that after a fleeting, agonizing moment of sanity, the shame and horror of his actions became too much to bear. He likely walked deeper into the mountains alone, succumbing to the elements and meeting a quiet end in the wilderness he once believed was saving them. A final, tragic figure lost to his own sorrow. 8 years after Elias' discovery, the case was considered a solved tragedy, yet it continued to fascinate forensic experts. Dr. Evelyn Reed, a renowned forensic anthropologist specializing in cold cases, was reviewing the Bennett file for a research project on hypothermia deaths. Her focus was not on the sensational story, but on the bone evidence. While meticulously examining the children's remains, she noticed a faint, almost invisible, pattern of microfractures on their fingers and toes, a detail overlooked in the initial investigation. The pattern was inconsistent with a simple death by exposure. It suggested a prolonged, repeated, almost ritualistic trauma. Evelyn's chilling conclusion was that they hadn't simply frozen. They had been deliberately, slowly, and systematically exposed to extreme cold over time. Diving deeper, she cross-referenced the journal's text with the weather patterns. From that fateful week in 1994, the data revealed that on the nights Robert described communing with the hum, the temperatures had plunged to dangerously low levels. But there was something more. In one entry, Robert wrote, "The hum is pleased with our offering of warmth." Evelyn's new hypothesis was terrifying. What if Robert's delusion was not simply a descent into madness, but a reaction to an external, controlling force? The final photo showed a man not just lost, but one who seemed to be obeying. Dr. Reed submitted her findings to a cold case unit, arguing that the deaths were a form of controlled hypothermia. The case of the Bennett family was no longer a simple tragedy caused by a man's mental break. It was now an unsolved homicide, with a perpetrator who had no physical presence, leaving behind only a whisper in a dead man's journal and a pattern of fear etched into bone. Detective Marcus Thorne, a hardened veteran of the cold case unit, read Dr. Reed's report with a heavy dose of skepticism. The detailed analysis of microfractures was compelling, but the theory of an external controlling force sounded like something out of a pulp novel. He called for a meeting, ready to politely dismiss her fringe hypothesis. When they met, Dr. Reed didn't try to persuade him with wild theories. Instead, she laid out the physical evidence, showing him high-resolution scans of the fractured bones. "These are not accidental injuries," she stated, "and they're not from a struggle. They're a stress pattern consistent with intentional, repeated trauma, perhaps from being forced into a freezing body of water or being held down in snow." Thorne was a man of evidence, and the bone analysis was irrefutable. Still, it didn't explain the hum. He spent the next week re-examining old files from the same time period, specifically cases involving bizarre disappearances in remote, wooded areas. He found two. The first, a lone hiker named Thomas Sterling, who vanished in the Appalachian Mountains in 1993. His journal was found a year later and contained strange ramblings about a vibrating song, and a calling to ascend from the flesh. The second was an entire family that disappeared in Colorado in 1995, leaving behind a note in their car that spoke of an unseen benefactor and a divine chorus. As Thorne placed the 3 case files on his desk, a chilling pattern emerged. Each disappearance was in a different state, but all were in heavily forested, remote regions, and each had a key piece of evidence, referencing a strange sound or force guiding them to their end. The Bennett family's tragedy wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something bigger. As he looked at the locations on a map, a terrifying possibility began to take shape, a trail of vanished people, stretching across the country, all led by a silent, unseen entity. The hum that was no longer just a delusion, but a terrifying and unexplained reality. Dr. Reed's report successfully reopened the case, and a joint task force was formed, led by Thorne and Reed themselves. They traveled to all 3 disappearance sites, searching for any additional clues, but their investigation was fruitless. They found no physical evidence linking the cases to human activity. Everything once again returned to an impenetrable mystery. Finally, Thorne and Reed decided to return to the Bennett family's cabin one last time. They sat in the very spot where Robert had been photographed, in complete silence. Suddenly, they began to hear a sound. It was the hum, a low-frequency sound, almost imperceptible, but it seemed to vibrate directly in their minds. It was not a sound made by a person or a machine, but a sound that emanated from the very depths of the forest itself. It wasn't melodic as Robert had described, but a hollow, emotionless drone that resonated like the pulse of the earth. It was then that they understood the terrifying truth. The hum was not a human delusion. It was not the temptation of a demon, and no one could ever be arrested for it. It was like a call from a brutal and ancient wilderness that had been waiting for thousands of years. It called only to those who were vulnerable or easily influenced. The Bennett family was just the latest victim among many who had heard its call. The case was closed once again. Thorne could not arrest the forest or an inexplicable sound. Their report was filed in a box labeled "Disappeared Without a Trace." The story taught them that horror does not always have a face. Sometimes it hides in the silence of the woods, where the hum continues to resonate to this day, waiting for the next person who will listen to it.